All right, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Today, we are going to learn a little bit more about the American beech tree and then also, unfortunately, a pretty devastating disease that's really plaguing these trees, especially in the northeastern United States. So let's dive right into that. So just to start off with, this is our first class in a new series. So we are still talking about trees, but we're going to be specifically talking about what we call trees under threat. So native tree species that are unfortunately being plagued by some kind of disease or insect species that's really causing decline in those populations. So today is on American Beech. In July, we're going to focus on American elm and Dutch elm disease. In August, we're going to cover eastern hemlock and woolly adelgid. And then finally in September, we're going to end on the very iconic American chestnut and then talk about chestnut blight and then even get into some of the different breeding programs a lot of our scientists are doing to try to bring the American chestnut back from really extinction. So let's move right into our information. So we're going to talk about the American beech, which is our Fagus grandifolia. Grandifolia actually means large leaf, and they belong to the Fagaceae family. And with the Fagaceae family, this is our same family as our oak species, our chestnuts, things like that. So a lot of these trees are deciduous tree species in the more temperate climate, whereas there may be some more evergreen species kind of found more in our tropical climates, but specifically American beech. This is a deciduous tree that's found across eastern North America, honestly, primarily east of the Mississippi River is where we see these really a part of our woodland environment. And so whenever you're out and you're seeing these trees, uh, typically they prefer more moist, well-draining, and acidic soils. They prefer to have more sunlight, but they can tolerate some shade. What you're most likely going to notice whenever you're seeing beeches is what we call a grove. And so beech trees have a very vast root system. And with that root system, they produce quite a few suckers. And so they can basically vegetatively propagate using those suckers. So whenever you see beech trees, usually you're seeing probably a bunch of them. Now, when you're looking at these trees, some of the characteristics, and we're also going to kind of talk about this into the next slide too, is this is a relatively low branching tree. And you probably maybe seen some quite big old specimens that you can hang around with. It's definitely a beloved tree, I would say, with children. Although one thing that's not so pleasant, I'll say this, is unfortunately some of the vandalism that children or people may unfortunately cause the American beech. So you can kind of see from this picture here, the American beech is easily identifiable by its bark. It has this very smooth, light gray bark. And so unfortunately, a lot of people, whenever they go by it, they like to put their initials into the tree or do the little heart and all that. And, please don't do that. Just like public service announcement, please don't do that to the tree. We don't want to cause the tree any harm because these are beautiful tree specimens and, they don't deserve that kind of treatment. So, just be mindful of that. And especially if you have like children, I myself have young children that I kind of worry about those little things, is just discourage them from doing any of that stuff. But anyway, let me go on from that. Um, also some characteristics is the American beech has some beautiful fall color. And you can kind of see this with the bottom picture. It has kind of more of a golden bronzy coloration to it. So it can actually be quite pretty. A lot of times we kind of think of it as like, oh, it's just brown. It's just brown. And it's not like some of the more beautiful scarlet reds that you see, but still in its own right, it is quite a nice shade of color for the fall. Now, moving on with some more characteristics that you might see. If you ever take a closer look at the branches and the stems on the American beech, they're somewhat zigzaggy. So you can kind of help to identify it just based on that, not just on the kind of smooth bark that you see. Now, the leaves themselves are just a simple leaf, alternate leaf arrangement. The leaves are generally more of this ovate shape and they're serrated, meaning that they have kind of those sharp indentations along the margins, along the edges of the leaf. Now, from up top, and you can kind of see this with this bottom picture a little bit, kind of on top of the leaf, it looks a little bit more glossy in color, whereas if you look on the underside, it's a bit of a lighter green. If you look on the midrib of the leaf, it can also be slightly tomatose too, might have a slight fuzz to it. Now, with this plant, it is what we call monoecious. Monoecious. So it produces separate male and female flowers. And so the male flowers are generally more drooping and long stemmed in these clusters, whereas the females are in these short spikes. And usually they're kind of these yellowish green colors that are going to appear in the springtime. Now, once those flowers are fertilized, the female flowers are fertilized, they're eventually going to give way to these really cool looking fruits. And you can kind of see that too with this bottom picture. So they have these really prickly brownish fruits. And inside, they have these triangular nuts, or what we call the beech nut. Now, I will say, typically with American beeches, you don't see them producing nuts until they're close to 40 years old. So you're not going to see this until they're kind of older specimens. But with that said, beech trees can last quite a long time. They can live really up to 200 plus years. So these can be very long-lived trees, honestly. And we'll get a little bit more into the beech nuts here in a second and kind of their edible, if they're edible, that sort of thing. One last thing I want to mention before I kind of move on to the next slide is this top picture. So some of you may have noticed this just from observation, but it is very typical for you to see young American beech trees hold onto their leaves through the winter months. So they just look like through the winter, while everything is, dormant, they hold on to these brown leaves. And that's actually something that we see in other trees that are within the same family, like oak trees tend to do that as well. And this, I will say, this is more common in more juvenile trees versus the beeches may grow out of that as they age. But kind of what scientists think is the reason why they hold on to these tree leaves. This is a concept that we call marcescens, is that either it's protecting the branches, the developing buds and things like that from like any kind of extreme elements, like environmental may protect from winds, just winter conditions, that sort of thing, but also may protect especially the lower branches from predators. And predators, I mean herbivores. I should be specific and say that, like deer, that may, try to eat the branches, the twigs, the leaves, so on. as a food source, especially if there's not a whole lot else available. So, again, they think this kind of might be a certain mechanism to protect from that kind of wildlife predation. So, yeah, so just an interesting thing that we do tend to see on our beaches and even our oak trees too. So let's get into importance. So I've kind of talked about this in the other classes that I've done on trees, the economic and ecological importance. So let's talk about economic first. First of all, this tree was used quite extensively by our indigenous populations. So a lot of our Native American tribes used American beech in different types of building materials, as well as medicine and as food. Um, Honestly, a lot of times they used this tree because, especially the nuts that we'll talk about too, mildly toxic, but can still be edible. But they used different parts of the tree for medicinal purposes in that, especially if they had digestive issues, like, or even parasites like parasitic intestinal worms that they were plagued with, they would consume from the beech tree to help kind of expel those out of their system for treatment. And so I'll go ahead and just kind of mention the food and then get back to the wood itself. But the beech nut, we consume the nut meat. You can eat it raw, or you can cook it or roast it. Um, what I would say is, though, you just have to watch because it does have what I said. It's mildly toxic. It does have some chemicals and tannins and things like that that could give you a little bit of an upset tummy if you eat large quantities of it. So you just kind of want to be mindful of that. But people do, in small quantities, tend to enjoy beech nuts, especially whenever they are roasted. Now, that's not really seen much on a commercial scale, but that might just be something that people do if they have these trees in their own backyard that are producing. Now, some other economic aspects of it, like I said, indigenous populations would use these for building materials. That's because the wood is very strong. It's very strong and it's very tough. And so you can use this in flooring, you can use it to make tools, make containers, and it even has a high fuel value to it as well. So it has multiple purposes there. But even that aside, even though we see these, of course, in our woodlands very commonly, American beech is a prized shade tree. A lot of people like it as a shade tree, especially if they have a decent yard or bigger landscape. And so it does have ornamental value to it because, again, these are beautifully shaped trees. They have the gorgeous bark, decent fall color. And so it does have aesthetic value from that perspective. Now, let's switch gears and talk about the ecological standpoint of this. So I've mentioned this before with our other trees, but especially with our oak trees too. This is a great host plant for many insect species. So again, a lot of our lepidopterans, our moths and butterfly caterpillars rely on this tree as a host plant to complete its life cycle. So this is one of those trees there, but other types of insects also rely on it as well. So it's definitely an important tree species to our native environment. Also, in addition to that, is with the nuts being edible, it's eaten by quite a few different kinds of animals. So we're talking small mammals, anything from, your squirrels and things like that, but even larger mammals, your white-tailed deer, your black bears. You get into birds, a lot of your turkeys, ruffed grouse, a lot of your blue jays, woodpeckers. They all enjoy these as well. And kind of speaking of woodpeckers too, these are a great tree as a nesting cavity for certain bird species like that as well. So really good, important tree to have in our local ecosystem to help support all of this wildlife. Okay. So I'm talking about American Beech and how essential it is, how important it is. So let's talk about why it would be incredibly devastating if all these trees just died or just declined. Um, because there is an issue with a disease of what we call beech bark, that is problematic. And I'll say this, for the most part, beech trees are pretty resilient trees, usually not prone to very many issues, but unfortunately, beech bark is just one of those things that I'm going to talk about that eventually could kill the tree. So this is actually a quote from our urban forest initiative at the university. That American beech is threatened by beech bark disease, a fungus that is carried by an exotic scale insect. The beech scale insect colonizes beech bark in rough areas, and their feeding activity allows the fungus to take hold, weakening and eventually killing the tree. So let me go more in depth on what all that is, because that's a lot of information. So let's kind of break it down. This disease kind of has two aspects to it. First, you have an insect. You have what's called the beech scale insect. Um, and unfortunately, with this, it was first seen, I think, around Nova Scotia, brought in from Europe in the 1890s. Of course, some of you that may have traveled in Europe, you might notice that there's a European beech over there that's very similar to our American beech. So it was also plagued by the same issues. And so this type of scale insect, and we have many, many different types of scale insects, unfortunately, that can plague our plant species. Um, and it's hard to kind of tell by this bottom picture, but I'll kind of show you some more pictures when we talk more in depth about it. But it almost creates like this white film, if you will, or these little white patches along the trunk. So you really can't miss it. Um, but the scale insect will damage not only the bark, but the vascular tissue under the bark, and it can be very problematic and weaken the tree. And then after, the scale insect starts to do that, that's where we get, unfortunately, a fungal pathogen that can come in and kind of take advantage of the situation. It can take advantage of kind of those areas where the scale insect was feeding, those open wounds, and it can infect the tree, which will ultimately, again, kind of lead to the demise of the tree itself. And there's different fungal species that we're talking about, specifically three of these. Now, I will say some of these fungal pathogens occur naturally. Other ones were introduced, and we have no idea where they came from. It's unfortunately one of those things where we don't always know where everything originates from, but it's here now, and it's something that we have to address. So let me talk first about the scale insect component. So you can kind of see the pictures here of what these little guys look like, and there's different stages. So they appear as this little white wool that covers the trunk of the tree. And again, Usually, they're not the ones that are actually killing the tree. It's the fungus that comes in after it that ultimately kills the tree. But these can still stress the tree out and weaken it. So you still want to have control over these insects. Now, with the scale, it could be feeding on these trees for a number of years before there's infection of that fungus. So, just because a tree has these scale insects does not mean that it also has beech bark disease already. It may not yet, but it definitely leaves it susceptible to it. Now, what's interesting about this scale, they kind of remind me in a way like aphids. Whereas with them and aphids, a lot of times these insects are only female. These are only female, and they are able to reproduce parthenogenically. Basically, meaning that they can almost like asexually reproduce. They can produce offspring without the help of a male. So they don't need to breed with a male in order to have offspring, which makes that very problematic, as you can imagine, because it means once the female gets big enough, it can just start popping out offspring, and then that population can easily explode and get out of hand. Unfortunately, that's what we see with some of our different insect species. So, what's its general kind of life cycle, if you will? Well, the females are going to produce about one brood of eggs per year. Typically, that's going to be in the early summer months into June or July, early to midsummer. And then eventually those eggs are going to hatch going into late summer in August or September. When they hatch, you have the little guys that we call crawlers. And these actually have legs and antenna, like you would think of with, an insect. But they are able to move and disperse to a different part of the tree. Okay, they can also be carried by birds, blown by the wind. So they are mobile, is what I'm getting at, where they can move to different sections of the tree and cause further problems as well. Eventually, what happens with these crawlers, they're going to secrete this waxy coating, and then that results in them molting, and they're going to overwinter as the second stage, the second instar stage, where they're then going to complete their life cycle come spring. Now, once they become full-fledged adults, I will say the adults are what we call sessile. They don't move. Okay. It's only the younger stage, the more juvenile stage, if you will, that actually moves. So the adults don't move, but they can still cause a lot of damage. And they're also protected. They have this very protective white wax layer that keeps them safe from predators, even resilient to maybe insecticides, things like that. But how they harm the tree is they have what we call a stylet that is able to pierce through the tissue of the tree and basically suck out the juices, all the good, sugary, nutritious juices of the tree, getting from that phloem tissue. So, yes, it's not just the crawlers that are problematic, it's every life stage is going to be an issue, which is why, again, this this insect can easily get out of hand quickly on these trees. So let's move into the second phase, if you will. So the beeches are infected by all these insects. Insects are leaving all these open areas where they've been feeding, okay? That's when you get fungal spores. Again, fungal spores are in the air. They can easily be windblown and find their way to these trees if they're around. And these type of sexual spores are what we call ascospores. And with ascospores, they are what we refer to as being opportunistic. meaning that they can infect the wounds done by the scale insects. Now, what happens whenever they infect those wound areas? You're going to see a couple things, okay? First off, when you start to get a more severe infection, you're going to notice symptoms on the tree. You're going to see that maybe the tree's producing smaller leaves, or the leaves are starting to look chlorotic, they're starting to yellow. Maybe you're starting to notice the canopy becoming thinner, so just more dieback in the branches of the canopy. And then, kind of this bottom picture, maybe you're also seeing what we call cankers, these wounded areas that are discolored and causing issues. And then on those cankers, kind of this top picture, you'll notice this is kind of evidence right here of the fungus that's taking over. The fungus produces these very vibrant red fruiting bodies, and oftentimes it is in a nice circular pattern that you see on the tree. So, especially once you kind of get this combination of this, that's when you know you've got issues with this disease, unfortunately. So, what happens once all these things occur? Well, like I said, unfortunately, it is eventually going to be a death sentence. But what we also see is this concept of beech snap. And what happens is those cankers, those wounds, they're going to continue to enlarge, and they're going to become worse and worse and worse until they're pretty much girdling around the trunk of the tree. And when a tree gets girdled, that is going to be what kills it, unfortunately. And that's what you're going to see is probably going to end up being like the final part of this disease. Um, and then also, what you'll notice with a lot of beech trees too is when they're weakened by the disease and they have that girdling, they have those cankers, if we get severe weather, extreme environmental conditions, we have what's called beech snap. And beech snap is when the trees just break. And you can kind of see here, they just kind of break from the bottom and then they just fall over, which, in the woods may not be quite as much of an issue. It is an issue if it's on a hiking path. And of course, nobody, you don't want to block a hiking path, or somebody doesn't need to be hiking whenever the beech snaps. But also, if you happen to have beeches that are on your property that are near a structure, if they're weakened by this tree, then they could pose a substantial hazard because of this, what we call beech snap. So we don't want that to happen. So, that could cause issues for people as well. So management. So is there anything that can be done to manage this disease? There are some options. First, if you're seeing the beech scale insect, but thankfully you don't have signs of fungal infection yet, you can control the population of the insect. A lot of times, even just doing a good spray, a good hosing off of the tree, unless it's pretty darn large and you can't, get up into it, can help to hose down that insect pretty good. Or you can use varying insecticides to help treat and kill those scale insects as well. But just know that that's going to be something you're going to have to be doing applications of that insecticide yearly. This is going to be on an every year basis, especially once the beech has those insects. You're probably never going to be able to get rid of them entirely. You just got to keep their populations under control. Now, something that's interesting is this disease has been around for a while, and what we have found is certain beeches are actually resistant to this disease, which is a good thing. It's not necessarily a death sentence for all beeches. there are certain specimens in the wild that can that can be tolerant or resistant of this problem. So that's good news. And what a lot of researchers and scientists are doing is they're developing these breeding programs where they are scouting for these, you know, specimens that are in the wild that have that resistance, and then they're going to try to breed them so that more and more beech trees eventually can have that immunity. So they can have that immunity towards the disease. So that is some positive. Another thing that you can do, and this is something that's more common, and again, where the problem arises in the northeastern United States that we see with a lot of foresters, what they do, where they selectively harvest and remove diseased beech trees. Um, so when they're removing the diseased beech trees, they're reducing the levels of that scale insect, and then they're keeping the beech trees that are resistant or partially resistant in the woods for a better chance of survival. So it's like you're cutting out the sick trees, okay, to kind of prevent more trees from not only getting infected, but just let the ones that are resistant in that area take over. And then with the hopes that their offspring someday will also be resistant too. So that's kind of, one of these like more sustainable forestry practices that are being done. But then also, again, finally, if you have like an aged beech, like an already declining beech, maybe it's declining from something else or it's just an older tree. Sometimes we'll recommend that you just go ahead and remove that aging tree because usually those aging trees or those stressed trees are going to be more susceptible to an attack from the scale insects. So you're kind of removing the older trees and letting the younger trees take over. Or also the concept that some beeches that may have a little bit more rough bark tend to actually be more prone to the beech scale. The beech scale like the rougher bark. And so you keep specimens that have the smoother bark in the forest because they don't care for those as much. So there's a lot of different ways that you can manage this disease without it being a total loss. Okay. So, if there's some positive to say with that, we still can find healthy trees. This isn't a complete decimation with some of the other diseases that we've come across with other tree species. So let me end on this slide here. And it kind of begs the question, is beech bark disease found in Kentucky? Well, my best answer is I don't think so. Question mark. I don't. Now, again, I might be totally wrong here, but I don't believe we have recorded cases in Kentucky, and somebody can correct me in the comments on that one. But it is around. With that, it is around. It's in neighboring states. So kind of the first map you can see in green, this is the natural range of American beech. So you can see, again, eastern United States. And then the bigger map, is from the USDA, the U.S. Forest Service. This is kind of the more recent one that I could find from 2023. So it's been a couple years, but you can see where it's been detected across the U.S. So you can very much see, oh, this is definitely a problem in the northeastern United States, kind of around the Great Lakes region. And then it's kind of making its way further south, kind of mid-Atlantic. But we do have cases in Ohio, we have cases in West Virginia, and Tennessee. So it is kind of knocking on our door, if you will. And we're not saying it's not here completely. It could potentially be in Kentucky, and we just may not be aware of it. And that's where we need to have monitoring of our big, heavy forests that are full of beeches and making sure that we're not noticing that disease there. So even though this is not necessarily a problem that we are going to have, that we have yet, it's something to be mindful of. And especially if you are traveling and you're going kind of more northeastern United States, you may also notice this, unfortunately, with some of the American beeches that are there. So hopefully this class kind of gives you the tools to really understand what American beeches are, identify them, but then also identify what the scale insect and the fungi that are causing the beech bark disease too. So with that, that's going to end my presentation for today.